What we are going to cover very briefly today is a important moral as well as theological issue that has been on the headlines over the last not only years but decades, but it has kind of intensified its presence in the last few months. And Monsignor Georg Genschwein, who used to be the personal secretary of Pope Benedict XVI, and who is now the prefect of the Pontifical House, taking care of all the public engagements of the present Pope, Pope Francis, talked about it as the 9/11 of the Catholic Church, in order to speak in order to indicate the tragedy and the scale of that horrific scandal, sexual abuses. And on top of that, what has been uncovered over the last few years has been happening within the context of and a kind of annus horribilis, a terrible year for the Catholic Church, not only as far as the abuses are concerned, but in a time when this institution that used to be seen as a stable, traditional, authoritative institution is now in the process of going through a time of turmoil and changing, therefore, the picture of a traditional, stable church into a church where chaos is reigning, and not only at the periphery but at the very top level. And when you have two popes, and this is in itself a kind of unusual situation for the Catholic Church, and when you have two popes, living popes, one reigning, one emeritus, and the one emeritus who, after resigning, promised to keep silent and to retire in prayer and solitude, and yet over the issue of the sexual abuse scandals, he has come back with a public statement indicating a different reading of the situation, different from what Pope Francis has been suggesting and has been indicating as the main issue involved in the scandals. We will be talking about this later. When top cardinals have become outspoken in denouncing the heresy of the Pope, the reigning Pope, that has not been happening for ages, at least publicly. Maybe there have been fights, inner fights within the institution, but these fights have been always covered under the protection of the credibility of the institution. Now, 3 years ago, we had 4 cardinals officially asking Pope Francis to clarify 4 issues in the application of the Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, the post-synodical exhortation resulting of the Synod of Bishops on the family, and introducing a kind of relaxation in the ways in which the Catholic Church would admit divorced people back to Eucharistic communion. So these 4 cardinals wrote to the Pope asking clarity on what to do and how to go about in dealing with these contentious issues. And the Pope never responded, never answered to these 4 questions. Unfortunately, 2 of the 4 cardinals died, and so there are 2 remaining ones still waiting for the canonical response. And there is in canon law, there is a provision for a cardinal to officially ask the Pope to clarify one more points in doctrines and morals, and in putting the question in such a way that the Pope only needs to respond yes or no. So it's not an open question saying, help me to clarify what you mean by... No, it's, do you mean this and that, yes or no? This is the canonical procedure. But Pope Francis didn't respond, and creating confusion, criticism, a sense of chaos. Not only that, but the former prefect of the Congregation for Sacred Doctrine, what used to be the Inquisition in the Catholic system, Cardinal Müller, the German cardinal, 4 months ago, issuing a manifesto of the faith, wanting to reaffirm the tenets of the Catholic faith in the presence of much confusion around the Church, and in open polemical stance against the Pope, saying, you, Pope Francis, you are introducing confusion, chaos, you are blurring the lines, the people is confused. So I, as the former person in charge of guarding the Catholic doctrine, I now write a manifesto helping you to become clearer in where you stand. Never happened before. That number 3 in the top Vatican leadership would become outspoken in criticizing number 1, and being the two people living at the same time 100 meters away from one another. Never happened before. You've never had top theologians, global theologians, coming up with criticism, outspoken criticism against Pope Francis. Thomas Wayne-Andy, a well-known Dominican, North American theologian, writing an open letter to Pope Francis, expressing his growing concerns over growing confusion in the teaching of the Church. And the last important theologian who became outspoken in his criticism was Aidan Nichols, the British, again, I think, Dominican monk, Blackfriars in Oxford, signing a letter, a public letter, signed with other 19, some of them important theologians within the Catholic Church, raising concerns and calling Pope Francis to move out of heresy. This is the term, this is the terminology, this is the vocabulary that is used. So, in that context, you see that 9/11 happens in the context of a terrible year for the Catholic Church. So, situation getting from bad, in a sense, from bad to worse. But back to the sexual abuse scandals, one of the reasons why it has become the 9/11 of the Catholic Church is that it is no longer confined, at least as far as the public opinion is concerned, it is no longer confined to one single region or province of the Catholic Church. Years ago, we had Ireland in the headlines. The Irish case was highly publicized, and in a way the Catholic Church kept on saying, yes, we had a problem in Ireland, there was a problem in that particular country. But then other significant charges were made in different parts of the world. Australia, having now the top 3, the third cardinal in the Catholic hierarchy, who used to be the one in charge of running the Vatican finances, is now in jail because of accusations and actually convictions, waiting for the second judgment. So we are not going to pass final judgments on him as far as even criminal law is concerned. But never happened that a cardinal is now in jail for these accusations. But not only Australia, in Chile we had bishops who had been defrocked from their office because of abuses committed against underage children. We have the case of Germany, where it is now become public that there have been more than 4,000 abused children in the last 30 years. And these stories are now becoming more and more public. And the last episode has to do with Poland. No longer than 10 days ago, a documentary was posted and on the internet. And it's a documentary that documents the story of 3 abused children, used to be children, but now are no longer children, accusing Catholic priests. And this video has been viewed by, I think, 21 million people, or at least it has had 21 million hits in a week in Poland. So the situation is really getting out of control, and not only involving minor or parish priests or people in remote areas, but involving leaders in the Catholic Church at all levels, from the parish level to bishops to cardinals, from Australia to Rome to Germany to the United States to Latin America. In a way, it's a global phenomenon. So that is a picture of the magnitude of what we're talking about. And just to give you a sense of what we are talking about, I put here a section of the report given by the grand jury of Pennsylvania in the United States, where a long list of cases has been reported, and this is an example of what we are talking about that is contained in that report, 2018. There have been other reports about child sex abuse within the Catholic Church, but never on this scale. So there is something bigger than the public opinion was aware of in previous years and decades. For many of us, those earlier stories happened someplace else and someplace away, not certainly in the US as far as this report is concerned. Now we know the truth. It happened everywhere. We heard the testimony of dozens of witnesses concerning clergy sex abuse. We reviewed 500,000 pages of internal diocesan documents. So what you're saying is that these are not new charges. These are charges that have been documented in the archives of different dioceses. So the church was aware of what was going on. The church had already collected testimonies of people denouncing abuses. They contained credible allegations against over 300 predator priests. Over 1,000 child victims were identifiable from the church's own record. So it is not new research, it is a research that is based on already documented evidence. We believe that the real number of children whose records were lost or who were afraid ever to come forward is in the thousands. So there are precise numbers as far as the known cases are concerned, but there is also an estimation. It can be overestimated, it can be underestimated, but the estimation of the jury is that we're talking about thousands of cases. Most of the victims were boys, but there were girls too. Some were teens, many were pre-pubescent. Some were manipulated with alcohol or pornography. Some were made to masturbate their assailants or were groped by them. Some were raped orally, some vaginally, some anally, but all of them were brushed aside in every part of the state by church leaders who preferred to protect the abusers and their institution above all. It's a picture of what we are talking about in the US, in Pennsylvania. And that can be easily reproducible in accounting for and reporting on other regions, other cases. Now, we're not going into the description of the phenomenon, because that would go way beyond my expertise. I'm not a journalist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a statistician, but what we are interested in this workshop is to begin to ask the question, what is the Catholic Church saying about these things? And especially, more narrow question is, what is the main problem that the Catholic Church is seeing in dealing with these terrible cases? Is there an initial attempt to come to terms? What caused such a horrible situation? What is the reason behind? What is the motivation, the main problem? Now, that's a very selected or reduced question, but in order for us to have an entry point into a more theological assessment or beginning of an assessment. Pope Francis, after the explosion of these cases, has become very vocal in denouncing clericalism as being the main problem behind the explosion of the scandals. The abuse of clerical power. That's the way in which Pope Francis begins to approach the tragedy of what has been happening in his church. It has been an abuse of clerical power. Made by people willing to make their own careers, by people exchanging the priestly office with an attempt to build their own empires, to self-gratify their own personalities, and made by people with evident personality disorders, abusing their office in order to achieve their disturbed and blurred desires. But clericalism, Pope Francis has spent no word concerning the issue of homosexuality or sexual disorders or other possible explanations, but has been focusing on clericalism as the main problem to be blamed in coming to terms with what has happened in the Catholic Church. A different answer has been coming from other sources, namely Monsignor Carlo Vigano, former nuncius of the Vatican See to the United States of America, denouncing the covering up of misbehaviors by Cardinal McCarrick, who then after his letter has been defrocked from even the cardinal condition, and in his open letters, Vigano talks about the prevailing influence of homosexual lobbies, political groups driven by homosexual individuals forming lobbies in order to influence the policies of the Catholic Church. The homosexual networks present in the Church must be eradicated. These homosexual networks, which are now widespread in many dioceses, seminaries, religious orders, etc., so they are spread out at every level of the structure of the Catholic Church, act under the concealment of secrecy, and lies with the power of octopus tentacles, strangling innocent victims and priestly vocations, and they are now strangling the entire church. There is a vicious homosexual lobby, according to this important Monsignor, and that lobby is the main responsible for what has been happening in the last years, and nobody has taken action to stop the homosexual lobby. So clericalism is one answer. The presence of homosexual lobbies is another answer. And the third answer comes from Pope Benedict, or the Pope Emeritus. No longer than 2 months ago, he wrote a paper and made sure to have it circulating even outside of Vatican circles, entitled "The Church and the Scandal of Sexual Abuse." So this is something that is totally unknown in the Catholic Church. Having two popes, that's something peculiar to this age, but having two popes actually addressing the same issue, coming from very different perspectives and offering very different readings of the same phenomenon. And they're both popes, one reigning, one emeritus. And Pope Benedict there gives us a very different interpretation and evaluation and assessment of what caused the present day problem. According to him, clericalism is, he never mentions clericalism as the issue or even the main issue. He talks about the relaxation in moral Catholic theology intervening after Vatican II, and the progressive absorption of moral and cultural trends coming from the sexual revolution and being accepted within the mainstream moral Catholic reflection, and lowering the standards, moving away from objective natural law, moving towards forms of subjectivism, and giving legitimacy to behaviors and lifestyles that are no longer considered as being objectively disordered, but are now seen, says Pope Benedict, as free choices in the name of personal freedom. Morality is no longer grounded in natural law, says Pope Benedict, and it is now exclusively determined by the purposes of human action. So it's a shift from, in technical terms, deontological ethics to a more teleological ethics. The morality of an action is not determined by the values behind it, but is rather to be determined by the purposes of the things that are achieved or accomplished. And if in a relationship love is what is at stake between the two partners, no one can say that it is a disordered relationship, because given the fact that there is love, there is no deontological principle that can deny the morality of that action. The morality is given by the intentions or the purposes of that action. And that, for Benedict, is a huge problem. And Benedict also talks about the growing welcoming of different trends in Catholic theology, and especially in Catholic moral theology, that no longer were stopped or limited or criticized, but were instead absorbed to become the norm, the mainstream. And that relaxation was filtered through through seminaries, filtered through diocesan life, filtered through Catholic theology and ongoing teaching. And even the quality of the seminarians who would come up to the seminaries in order to be trained for the priesthood, the moral quality, the moral standards, the quality of their theological convictions downgraded to the point of becoming almost different or not different from everybody else. So different approaches to what is the main problem. So this is something that is a topic of ongoing discussion within the Catholic Church. We are also, the seminar is not to give answers, because we are still living these things as they happen, but it is intended to be at least an initial help to map out what is happening in terms of the theological reflection happening within the Catholic Church. Of course, the issue is not only moral and is not only theological, but the evidence shows that there have been institutional evil patterns of behavior that have created the conditions for these abuses to be committed and to be tolerated and to be covered up. And so there is a sense in which every institution, be it religious or secular or economic or social, tends to move towards self-defensive and self-protective behaviors and patterns of behavior. And this has been also the case for the Catholic Church. This is a list of institutional patterns of behavior that have contributed to create the milieu, the cultural institutional milieu that has made it possible for these crimes to be committed. The denial or the underestimation of the problem. You know, the black sheep metaphor. Every family has its own black sheep. Every little family, every church, every community, every city, every neighborhood, every nation, every whatever, there is this black sheep metaphor, and this has been the consistent way of dealing with the problem, even when the scale of it was of lesser dimensions than what it is now. But it is no longer possible. That metaphor no longer works, because it is happening everywhere at all levels. And so either we shift our perception of the institution of being made by black sheep, and not only being inhabited by few black sheep, or this attempt to defend the institution doesn't work. The silencing or isolating or threatening of the victims. That's another defensive approach. When there is a problem, when someone raises his voice or denounces a crime or an abuse, the general tendency has been to silence it or to isolate it or even to threaten it. Non-collaborative attitudes with secular investigating and judicial authorities, claiming the principle of the freedom of the church to rule its own affairs according to the rules of the church and according to the structure of the church. And so, given the fact that these were considered as being instances having happened within the life of the church, there has been a non-collaborative attitude when secular investigating authorities have been called into question by people who have denounced the abuses. Self-defensive and self-protective attitudes of the institution, or another way of dealing with the problem has often been the moving of abusers around without stopping them, thinking that a predator or an abuser would stop doing the crimes after having been moved to another parish or diocese. And that has been also very common in Catholic practice. Covering up of high-rank officials, and also that has been another contributing factor, especially in majority Roman Catholic cultures, where the majority culture has had the tendency to accept the fact that the church was and is beyond scrutiny and has superior ends and reasons to act as she acts. So we are not in no position to judge. The church knows what she is doing, and there is a sense of respect, trust of the church that she is handling the issues properly. Now, this attitude is rapidly changed into becoming an attitude of suspicion and even of vocal criticism. But that has been a factor in allowing these crimes to be perpetrated without raising serious concerns from the public opinion until recent years. So these are institutional issues that help us to begin to understand what caused the phenomenon we are describing. We're now raising three theological issues that are part of the conversation that is going on within the Catholic Church, although given the fact that the three main identifiable responses that are coming through so far are not really dealing with any of them in essence, but they are part of the issues that need to be addressed if we want to at least have a more theological understanding of the roots of the problem. We have to ask whether one of the problems has to do with the theology of clerical authority. Pope Francis is aware that something wrong has happened in terms of an abuse of power, abnormal use of power, and locating that abuse in individual abusers, abusing of their office. The issue needs to be raised whether this abuse is not built into the theology of that clerical authority. If that abuse, of course, is an individual abuse, is a personal abuse, is a terrible personal abuse, but the issue is whether or not the propensity towards it and the record, not only the recent record, but the historical record that we have, not only in the in accounting for the sexual abuses, but in the culture of abuse, in the culture of control, in the culture of coercion. There are different forms in which these abuses may appear and have appeared. If there is something deeper than the abuse that needs to be accounted for, whether or not it is the theology of the authority of the Catholic Church, of the Church and in the Church, and that close connection between the person of Christ and the person of the priest, acting in persona Christi as a representative of Christ, and leading to an abnormal exercise of the royal office. The royal office of Christ, the one by which He rules over the whole world, is given to the ordained priest who acts on His behalf, and without proper accountability structures, and within a framework of an imperial structure, top-down, hierarchical, pyramidal structure, which has few accountability filters. And if one acts in persona Christi without accountability structures around him, if the problem is whether or not the issue is not so much in the abuse, but also theologically speaking, of course, not criminally speaking or morally speaking, but theologically speaking, if it's the theology of that clerical authority that gives too much power, that attributes too much of the powers of Christ to one single person within the context of a hierarchical imperial structure, is it not this very theology of clerical authority that leads to or nurtures a culture of coercion and of whereby consciences are controlled? These are questions that need to be asked gently, graciously, kindly, but as theologians, as people who want to see things not only through the lenses of general morality or sociology or criminal law, but also want to see things through the lenses of theological reflection. I think there is a case that I think can be made that focuses on this very point. The rule of celibacy, that's another aspect of perhaps the same problem, another angle of the same issue. You all know that the Catholic Church forbids priests from being married, and Vigano's thesis argues that it is also because of that gay lobbies have become powerful. Gay behaviors have become accepted and tolerated. And a few years ago, no longer than 7 years ago, just to give you an example, an Italian journalist, a gay Italian journalist, he published a book, Sex and the Vatican. And he wrote in this book his experience as a gay person in Rome, entering the chat lines, entering the gay community, becoming part of this gay community, and giving multiple examples of the presence in these communities of seminarians, priests, bishops, and even cardinals, and suggesting even the fact that, at least as far as Rome is concerned, in Rome, almost 60% of the clergy is sexually active, whether in homosexual relationships or in heterosexual relationships. But nonetheless, if that is a number that maybe is overestimated, but even if the number was 20%, 25%, 15%, still there is something that has been going wrong in the application of this rule. And is the Catholic Church ready to rethink that rule? That is not part of the biblical teaching. In actual fact, the one who is claimed to be the first pope, Peter, was married, and so didn't set the good example for the rest of the priests. But Peter was married, Paul perhaps was not. So in the Bible we have both examples of people who can be apostles and pastors and ministers of the church in both conditions, married and unmarried. And that straitjacket that the Catholic Church, the Western tradition, the Catholic Church has put on priests, is it something that needs to be rethought and revised? No one is actually talking about this in the reflection that is going on between Pope Francis, Pope Benedict. This is not something that today is discussed under discussion, at least at that level. There are, of course, movements within the Catholic Church, and especially outside of the Catholic Church, who are putting pressure in order to change that rule. But what is the relationship between the rule of celibacy and the abuse, the sexual abuse scandals? This is something that has not been addressed, at least as far as I am aware. No one is asking the hard questions of theological authority or the theology of clerical authority, and few people in the top leadership of the Catholic Church is actually dealing with the rule of celibacy. And then Pope Benedict the Emeritus, he suggests that there is also a third theological issue as far as the abuses are concerned, and has to do with the Second Vatican Council, the relaxation brought about at the Second Vatican Council with its new style, new posture, new attitude, affirming, embracing, baptizing the modern world and modern culture, and offering and promoting a kind of cheap grace form of Catholicism. And the relationship between the Church and the world, or the Church in the world, has dramatically changed with and after Vatican II. So that the borders, the boundaries, the distinctions of the Church and the world have become so downplayed that the end result is that the world has come in the Church and has imposed its own standards. But who is going now to question the main teachings of Vatican II? Who is going to take the lead in asking serious questions about the feasibility, the legitimacy, and the consequences of this teaching? Again, is it only a case of abuses, or is it not something that is inherently problematic within the corpus, the body of Vatican II teachings, and the spirit of the Council that emerged out of the Council or after the Council? So these are issues that we need to address if we want to deal with what has been happening, not only from the sociological, moral, institutional, criminal point of view, but also taking advantage of this disastrous situation to ask theological questions. And not only asking these questions to the Catholic Church, but first and foremost asking these questions to our churches, to ourselves. Whether or not something in our theology of the authority of the Church or exercised in the Church, is it more of a child of an imperial ideology rather than the exercise of authority in the name of Christ, through the example of Christ, by the word of Christ, in the body of Christ, according to the patterns of Christ? Are we imposing rules to church members and church leaders that are not driven by biblical teaching but are imposed by our own traditions? And what is the posture of our churches with regards to the world? Are we too friendly with the world? Are we too enemies of the world? These are questions that each one of us needs to ask for ourselves, and also needs to ask or help the Catholic Church to ask for herself, and in this very precise context. So we have now time to listen to your... there is another slide here. So what is at stake in our threefold question: theology of clerical authority, the rule of celibacy, and the relationship between the world, the Church and the world, or the Church in the world? Both constitutive elements of Roman Catholicism are here at stake. On the one hand, the Roman element that has to do with the authority structure, the canon, the laws, the principles of the way in which the Church functions, they need to be re-examined. The way in which authority is exercised is one way for the Church to be Roman. The Church is Roman Catholic because it has inherited that Roman blueprint. And it is in the Roman blueprint that the theology of authority is part of. And also the Catholic element, that more embracing, including universalist tendency of the Catholic Church that has produced the relaxation of Vatican II aimed at the inclusion of the world. Both elements that are constitutive to the tension forming the Catholic system need to be examined. It is not only a matter of law the Roman element, and not only a matter of the present day embracing attitude resulted out of Vatican II. Both elements need to be reconsidered. And all attempts to single out the main issue, clericalism, the power of gay lobbies, and the absorption of the sexual revolution, they are all attempts that do indicate an aspect of the problem, but fail to tackle it theologically. So my final comment is the following: is there going to be the willingness to move beyond clericalism, homosexualism, and the acceptance of moral relativism to ask, is there a deeper one, a deeper problem that lies in the very self-understanding of the Roman Catholic Church, and that has produced the context that has been the one in which these crimes have been committed?